Hello, everyone. My name is Brenda Farrell, and I would like to welcome you all to the first webinar of our 2016 series, Innovative Interventions to Support Families Living in Poverty. I am a project analyst at the National Abandoned Infant Assistance Resource Center. We're located at the University of California at Berkeley. Our mission is to enhance the quality of social and health services delivered to children and families affected by substance abuse and/or HIV by providing quality training, information, and resources to the professionals who work directly with these families. Today's webinar will be presented by Stephanie Jones and her colleague, Rebecca Bailey, from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that you can ask questions using the chat feature in the lower left portion of your screen. We will leave some time at the end of the presentation for questions, but please feel free to chat your questions in at any point. Questions will be answered in the order in which they are received. And now I'd like to turn it over to Stephanie and Becca. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hello, everyone. This is Stephanie Jones from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and this is my colleague, Rebecca Bailey.
Hello.
The title of our presentation today is Executive Function and Self-Regulation in Context, the Role of Stress and Poverty and Opportunities for Intervention. And I should just say at the outset that a great deal of the work that we are going to present today stems from a whole set of intervention, development, and evaluation projects that we've been doing together over the last 5 to 10 years. And we're providing you today with some of the background research that underlies our intervention work and just a selection of example intervention strategies and approaches. And we are, of course, always happy to connect with anyone to talk about the broader body of work that we do. So, moving right along. Okay, so our outline for the hour or so that we have together is broken into 4 major parts. The first is really about understanding and defining executive function and self-regulation in children and adults. And we're going to talk about really what the skills are and reflect a little bit on developmental patterns. As everybody probably on the call knows, there's a great deal of interest today in executive function, and there's a good reason for that because there's a great deal of emerging brain science that supports the important role of executive function in everyday life. But there's relatively little that's concrete about what the skills look like in behavior, in the world, how they're influenced by context, and then really and truly what you might do to support them and foster them. So we're going to talk about we're going to define executive function and self-regulation as a path to getting to intervention that lines closely up with what we understand executive function and self-regulation to be. Okay, so the second part is really trying to understand executive function and related self-regulation in context. So what influences the development and use of executive function skills in the real world? And then the third area, and this is where Becca will jump in, is talking about strategies and opportunities for intervention. So building on this research base, what should we do? What could be targeted, and how might it happen? And we'll talk through, in brief, an example intervention arm that we call Secure for Parents and Children. And it is just one component of a more complex set of interventions that we're also happy to talk about, either when there are questions or in the future. And then finally, we'll end with some implications. And then we look forward to a whole lot of conversation afterwards. Okay, so starting out with the definitional work, executive functions are defined technically. So in the technical research literature, they're defined as a set of cognitive processes that are located in the prefrontal cortex, which is that front part of your brain, right behind your forehead, that essentially coordinate and integrate the broader functions of thought, memory, emotions, and motor movement. So if you look to the right at the little graphic of the brain and the person who's kind of at the wheel there, the executive functions and the prefrontal cortex are really understood to be the kind of drivers of all components of functioning. So it's the executive at the head of the company managing everything and thinking through what's coming, what's happening now, and how to get between the two. So they're essentially core brain processes, and they're often defined in 4 ways, but sometimes in only 3. I'll cover all 4. The first is working memory. So this is remembering a small number of things in real time, but also is about updating memory with new information in the short term. The second is attention control, and attention control is really about focusing and marshaling and sustaining your attention. Attention shifting is similar, but it's really about shifting attention, so moving from one thing to the next, and in more complex forms is about shifting your thinking, so shifting from one mindset to another, or shifting one's thinking to take another's perspective, and so on. And then finally, probably the most oft-cited component is response inhibition, which is at its core about inhibiting dominant responses in favor of something that is more relevant and more useful in the setting. So these 4 core brain processes drive more complex thinking. They drive purposeful, planful, goal-directed behavior. And they're really important for behavior in all kinds of areas. So they're important for parenting and parenthood. They're important for being successful in higher education. They're important for being successful in their workforce, in addition to being important in everyday behaviors for children and adults. Okay, next slide. So the research on executive function suggests that these core processes are foundational to more complex behaviors and skills in multiple areas. So over on the left are a set of basic academically oriented skills and behaviors, like academic behaviors and work habits, being focused and engaged in learning activities, and effectively and smoothly moving from one thing to the other, so transitioning from one thing to the other, making a plan and acting on it, and organizing one's work. In the middle column, we have a kind of general emotional domain, which is about having and holding empathy for others, being able to jump into the shoes of others and take their perspectives. It's about core emotion and behavioral regulation, so managing and modulating emotional responses in oneself and then understanding them in others. And then related, emotion knowledge and expression. And then over on the right, we have a set of more complex social behaviors, like conflict resolution and problem solving, understanding the social environment, so being able to really notice and understand the cues in the social world, so the visual cues, the verbal cues that others are sending out. And then also engaging in basic pro-social and cooperative behavior. So that's a kind of broad overview of executive function. And in the next slide, we're going to get a little more specific about each of these skills and define their technical definitions, but also for kids, what you might see in behavior that is aligned with each of these areas. So in this slide, we have those 4 domains, those 4 core brain processes, and then at the top for each one, there's a technical definition, and right underneath it is more what we call an applied definition. So for working memory, for example, that's defined technically as the ability to hold a piece of information in mind and manipulate it or update it over a short amount of time. So if you imagine a young child, a 5-year-old, for example, you could see this in their behavior as the ability to remember 2 to 3 simple steps or directions, typically in the face of minor distractions or interruptions. So in a classroom, that might be everybody put your paper away, get your coat, and line up at the door. So it's just 2 to 3 simple steps or directions that have to be remembered and enacted in sequence in the face of some complexity. Over to the right, we have attention control, which is defined technically as the ability to choose what to pay attention to and what to ignore, and to maintain attention in a particular direction. So for example, for a child, this is really about staying on task even when it gets difficult, or one is tired. It's concentrating on a project for a sustained period of time, even when alone. So it's being able to marshal your attention and stick with it. Down in the bottom left, attention shifting, or also known as, in some places, cognitive flexibility, technically described as the ability to switch between thinking about 2 different concepts and to think about multiple concepts simultaneously. So for example, in behavior, this is really about shifting from one part of a problem to another, or comparing and contrasting an idea or perspective, or shifting from one task to another. And then finally, response inhibition, fundamentally the ability to inhibit responses or behaviors inappropriate to the context or the task demands. So it's about being able to manage behavior in response to what's required in the situation. So for example, the classic example used very often is raising one's hand instead of shouting out an answer, or persisting even when a task gets hard. So moving on to the next slide. In adults, these core brain process skills are often referred to as planning. So just even in the language, you can see that the terminology used to define these skills is slightly more sophisticated in adults, so it's a little bit more complex. Planning is identifying long-term goals and obstacles and solutions to reaching them, specifying a sequence of steps, and setting interim goals. So you can imagine I made these examples thinking about the kinds of things that as an adult I typically need to do in my own life, which is making arrangements for childcare. So thinking about when one is going to need some support in caring for young children, getting oneself ready for work while at the same time getting children up and ready for school. So that takes thinking through the sequence of steps that are necessary to get out the door and all the parts that have to go into it, and moving through them in a manner that ends up with the goal reached. Right over on the right is self-control, which is fundamentally about controlling one's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So for example, not getting distracted from a goal, not getting angry, not making an impulsive decision, typically under stress and strain. So the planning and the self-control in thinking about getting children out the door in the morning clearly need to go together. Down at the bottom, we have monitoring, which is awareness of one's thoughts, feelings, behavior, performance, progress, others' behavior, the context, and the broader surroundings. So it's really about reading the environment and keeping track and using information and feedback that is coming in the moment. So an example is sort of thinking about what is working about this situation. Is what I'm doing, is how I'm thinking and responding appropriate to this setting? Does it make sense here? Am I able to judge and understand the cues that are coming back to me? What are her, for example, facial cues really telling me? So you can see how these skills for adults embody many of the component skills for children. So planning requires some level of working memory, self-control, employs attentional control, shifting, and response inhibition, and monitoring includes attention control, and so on. So you can see I'm beginning to tell a narrative about how the component skills in children weave together over time and form these more complex versions in adults. So moving to the next slide, echoing what I was just saying, executive functions are interrelated. So in children, for example, the processes and skills develop independently, but over time become increasingly coordinated, which means that they work together in a seamless fashion. So I just put a little example, again, drawing on my own life with my young son at home in the morning. To leave the house in the morning, he really needs to put his socks on before his shoes. So he needs to use his working memory to remember that that's what he has to do in the moment, but also that he has to get those socks on before he puts on the shoes. And there have been many moments when the shoes are on, but the socks are still lying on the floor. So remembering that sequence of how those things go on. For him, he often needs to leave his baseball cards on the counter, so he has to stop playing with those baseball cards, so he has to shift his attention away, and he has to engage in response inhibition, which means he has to stop doing something that is desired in service of something that is not, which is putting the socks on and the shoes on. He has to put his lunch and his snack and his homework in the backpack. It takes working memory. He has to remember all of those things and get them in there. And he has to inhibit by not eating the snack. So by the time he's doing this, he's hungry, and he has to not eat that snack, thinking, I need this later, because I will be hungry again. He has to tie his shoes, which is complex for a young child and takes every single one of these skills. So working memory, you need to remember the sequence of steps. Response inhibition, which is not just getting super mad and yelling out to have someone else do it, and attention shifting. And all of this is happening in the context of a level of strain, typically, which is the press to get out the door. So there is a vibration of tension going on, and all of these things have to happen in the face of that tension. There's distractions, there's time pressure, and of course a number of other things. So moving on to the next slide, we can see very clearly how adult and child executive function related behaviors are totally tied together. So right at the top there, you can see that in children, it's the same thing I just described from the prior slide, but I put it next to what we imagine adults need to do in that same situations in dynamic interaction with children. So again, to leave the house in the morning, adults need to plan to come back. So they're thinking in their head, what do I need to set up in this house or this apartment or this place to come back and be ready for the next thing. So what am I planning for later in the day to make that part of the day effective? I have to remember a bunch of things. So I might need to remember the keys to the house. I might need to remember the car keys, the keys to my office, or the keys to my job. At the same time, continually monitor and manage all those child activities that are going on at the same time, which requires, as many people know who have children and engage in these kinds of mornings, you have to maintain self-control and probably continually update your plan as you're going through the morning, given what children are doing. And all of this is happening for adults just in the same way it's happening for kids, in the face of distractions, a whole lot of time pressure, and the stress that evokes. So moving on to the next slide, we shift to, to what we know about how these skills develop over time. And this is a graphic from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, which, by the way, for those of you who are interested, has just a vast array of resources on this topic, and videos and PowerPoints, and I highly recommend it. But for now, we just took this graph. And this is executive function skill proficiency, so really the expansion of the executive functions across age. So at the bottom, you can see the axis goes from 0 essentially to adulthood. And what we've learned from neuroscience is that there's a really rapid expansion in the use of these skills that coincides actually with rapid expansion of the prefrontal cortex between the ages of roughly 3 and 6 years. And that's that first rise in the graph. But also, really importantly, there's a second period of expansion during the transition to adulthood. So during the point at which adults or young adults are moving into other roles. They're transitioning into work, so moving from schooling to work, and often moving into parenting. So there's this interesting coinciding of developmental periods that represent opportunities both to really work on and build these skills as a support for all these important functions in the world, but also at the same time an opportunity for loss, right? So if we're not actively working on them during these periods, it could be that it's harder to build them and work on them at other times when there isn't this expansion or expansive developmental growth. Okay, moving to the next slide. We know that executive functions and related skills emerge and change over time. This is another way of thinking about executive functions in relation to other skills. And what we've learned is that key skills serve as foundations for others. So executive functions, which are down in that blue block at the bottom, which is labeled 1, and they're over in the column on the left, they emerge first and grow significantly during those early childhood years, and they provide a foundation for other more sophisticated cognitive, emotional, and social skills and behavior. And they continue to grow, of course, throughout childhood, but importantly, have that second bump in late adolescence. At the same time, during this early period, there's an expansion in sort of basic emotion and behavior management, likely tied to those core executive functions, and an expansion in basic emotion knowledge and expression. At the same time, over on the right, there is an emergence of basic social engagement. So this is what we're thinking about this with children, that during this key period of between the years of 3 and 6, children are often in their first organized social environment, either a child care setting or an early education setting or some other kind of home family care setting, and they're really beginning to engage in a different way in the social world. In the second block, which is labeled 2, are more complex and sophisticated skills that build on that foundation and emerge next, including things like planning and organizing and setting goals. The more sophisticated emotion skill include empathy and perspective taking, and then on the social side includes understanding and reading social cues. Then over in the third block, which is kind of located on the right and is labeled 3, we have a more sophisticated set of skills like pro-social cooperation, conflict resolution. And the point behind this picture is that there are skills that emerge first and serve as the basis for more complex skills, but also that certain things are really salient at different times. So there is this, based on the prior slide, this important expansion in these skills in early childhood, which is an opportunity to grow them. And they serve as a foundation for more complex things later on. So we can think about this developmental picture as giving us a view into where are the opportunities to do the work developmentally that serve other purposes later on. Okay, next slide. So in our intervention work, we have tried to push the distinction between those technical definitions that I gave you before and those applied definitions that were coupled with them, distinguishing between the kinds of core processes that are embedded in the brain and those kinds of skills that they support in the world. So when we were thinking about how to build intervention approaches, we wanted to develop a model that was very clear in distinguishing those. And so we developed this model, and it kind of guided how we structured our intervention work. And we have here those core executive functions. They are the foundation of more complex skills and processes that support functioning and behavior in multiple areas, so in an emotional area, a cognitive area, and a social area. And each of those domains has specific knowledge, skills, and experiences that support successful behavior in those domains. And then together, over time, they weave into this sort of coordinated regulatory gestalt. So we love to make models like this And it helps us think about what are the kinds of strategies are we going to build that support those core executive functions that serve as the basis for more complex behaviors and skills in the world, and what are we going to build that support those more complex skills and behaviors in the world. And we've used this model to make the case for the role of, or at least to better understand the role of this body of skills in future success. And there's a great deal of science that has linked aspects of this regulatory gestalt of self and in social interaction to both to academic skills and behaviors, to social emotional skills and behaviors and interactions, and to work-related skills and behaviors. So that Moffitt study that came out a few years ago linked self-control, which is an indicator of self-regulation, to success 25 to 30 years later in all kinds of domains. And so in understanding that finding, we tried to unpack the components that make up self-control and that give us a view into what we could do in intervention work. Moving to the next slide, and turning to the question of what influences the development of executive function and self-regulation. In our work, we are focused on poverty, risk, and stress, and we know from a vast number of studies that poverty, risk, and stress are very closely tied to this domain in particular, and we've just highlighted a few here. In particular, 1 in 5 children growing up in poverty have increased risk for social emotional difficulty, so difficulty in these areas more generally. We also know that children who experience early adversity, so the kinds of risks that co-occur with poverty, are more likely to exhibit challenges with executive functioning and self-regulation, and there are a whole vast number of studies that make that link. The question, of course, is why? So, and there's emerging work to suggest that the chronic fear, anxiety, and in particular the stress associated with unpredictable or chaotic environments, so experiences that have often been linked to poverty and its cofactors, can interrupt or disrupt brain architecture. So particularly the growth and change in the brain that is tied to these areas, so tied to executive function and emotion management. And again, we have a couple of little pictures from the Center on the Developing Child that show typical neural development in the brain, which goes from not a lot of connections at birth to a vast number of connections in the early years that are then pruned away as children age and go into adolescence. Under conditions of stress and strain, that process is interrupted. So there are fewer of those connections made during that key period in early childhood. And there's something about how stress interrupts how those connections are made, and it's not permanent by any means, but there is a link between experiences of stress and what is actually happening in the brain. Next slide. So how do we really understand stress? We know from our own life experiences and those who we partner with and from research that we face different types of stress, and there are stressors that can be defined in different ways. The first is positive stress, which is a typical and normal part of healthy development. It's a little stressful to lead a webinar, right? Or to stand up in front of others and speak. And it leads to brief increases in heart rate or mild elevation in stress hormones, but it's easy to recover from that with some support. There's also a next level up, which is tolerable stress. It's more severe, but the effects can be managed with support. So it could lead to serious but temporary stress responses that are buffered by supportive relationships. So it's significant, but one can recover from it with support. And then there's toxic stress, and this is the kind of stress that we want to focus on, which is strong, prolonged stress that can disrupt brain development and increase the risk of health outcomes, poor health outcomes in the future, and cognitive impairment. And toxic stress is a kind of ongoing, everyday, accumulated experiences of strain. And it is defined as toxic because research has identified its link to poor health outcomes in the future. Moving to the next slide. So toxic stress typically results from two possible things: a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, or an accumulation of distressing or disturbing experiences over time. And an accumulation of distressing or disturbing experiences over time can be just the everyday chronic strain that comes from financial hardship and all of the cofactors that go along with it. So it doesn't necessarily mean an accumulation of deeply distressing or disturbing experiences over time. It can be just the accumulation of the everyday strain that can result in toxic stress. Moving to the next slide. So what do we know about toxic stress and trauma? In many sectors, toxic stress or persistent toxic stress is referred to as complex trauma, which we know affects our brain chemistry in ways that can challenge a whole lot of important outcomes like learning, including making it more difficult to remember, to pay attention, to regulate one's behaviors, thoughts, and emotions, to plan, to organize. So you can begin to see that there's this dynamic between how the brain develops experiences of stress and those core executive functions and regulated behaviors that I described at the beginning. And the question is, how does this happen? And on the next slide, we've kind of put together a very general description of how the parts go together. And I should admit that I'm not a brain scientist, and neither is Becca. But we've delved deeply into this research, and we think it's really central to thinking about intervention work and trying to understand what sits behind the kinds of behaviors that we see. So we have the prefrontal cortex, which is, as I defined before, this decision or control center of the brain. It is responsible for slow thinking, for planning and goal setting and inhibiting impulses, as I described before. It's this kind of executive who is carefully considering all options and making a plan and responding with careful consideration. And then, also in the brain, there is the amygdala and the limbic structures. So this is the part sort of in the center of the brain that is described as the reactive center of the brain. This is the part that manages arousal, fear, the emotion center of the brain. Arousal, fear, anxiety, anger, motivation, and aggression, and is really responsible for fast thinking. So this is the part of the brain that evolved to keep us safe in the face of serious threat, right? So this is the part of the brain that should take over when one finds oneself faced with a lion running into the room. So when the lion runs into the room, you want your emotion center of the brain to take over and get you running out of the room without thinking about it. It doesn't help in that situation to say, well, what should I do here? What's my plan for getting away from this lion? In the end, these two brain regions are very closely linked through what we call a stress response system. And what happens with chronic exposure to stress and strain is that that emotion center, reactive center of the brain is more likely to take over under conditions of stress. So it happens in an everyday way, and stress then takes that front part of the brain out of control, so takes it offline, and the more reactive center of the brain takes over. And this is adaptive in certain circumstances, but not in everyday situations. It's not adaptive in school, home, work, relationships, and it really undermines executive functions and goal-directed behaviors. The kinds of triggers for children and adults who've been chronically exposed to strain and stress can be very simple. So it could be for a child, it could be a slamming door. It could be a harsh word. It could be being asked a question and not knowing the answer to it. So those are very simple everyday events that could begin this response and take that kind of planning, organizing, the knowledge, the strategies that are located in the prefrontal cortex offline. So overall, the bottom line for us and how we think about it is that we know from the science that low-income children and adults who face toxic levels of stress are at higher risk for behavioral and neurocognitive difficulties with executive function and self-regulation. The truth is, though, in reality, is that it's not simply about deficits. It's not a deficit-oriented way of thinking. It's that stress impedes the use of executive function and their related regulated behaviors. So it's harder under conditions of stress and strain to use what you already know, to use what you have in your arsenal, to plan, to monitor, to access your better judgment under conditions of trauma, stress, and strain. And this is actually the case for everyone. You can imagine situations or everyday moments in your own life where you forget what you were thinking, or you forget your plan, and it's because something else has taken over, and the stress system in your body has taken that front part of your brain where you have your strategies offline. The challenge is that the distance between reactivity, so the part that is reactive, and making an impulsive decision is really shorter for those with a history of toxic stress. So the connection between the two is shorter. Or for others who are experiencing just everyday barriers like exhaustion and stress in the moment. So when we think about how to use this body of science in the service of intervention, we know that executive functions and self-regulation skills are amenable to change. There's a great deal of evidence that there's a lot of opportunity to support and build these skills. And we've done a review of the literature, and what we've noticed is that there are a number of characteristics of effective interventions that serve as opportunities. Effective interventions include activities that are short and targeted. They provide multiple opportunities to practice. They are progressively more difficult and demanding, so they are challenging over time. They happen in the context of a supportive and encouraging environment. They're frequently embedded directly in social interactions and relationships, so the successful interventions are not through technology typically. And role models, mentors, coaches, other allies who are in one's environment are typically the best support. We know that these kinds of skills are learned through exposure, through some direct instruction and making things explicit, and through lots of practice. And that really fundamentally, we've learned that at its core, it's about slowing down, noticing the moment before doing something. So there are some basic fundamental ideas that are embedded in a lot of our intervention work that organize around some core components, which is this slowing down, noticing, reflecting, and I hope that you'll see that in some of the strategies that Becca is going to describe next. And here she is. I'm turning the computer to her.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the set of interventions that we have been developing to build executive function and related skills. And our set of interventions are known as SECURE. It stands for Social, Emotional, and Cognitive Understanding and Regulation in Education, because we really started in the school setting, although we now work with families and other community members outside of school. And our work really started looking at young children, so birth through age 10, but focusing really intensely on the pre-K to third age range, in part because of that really expansive growth in the prefrontal cortex and that opportunity to intervene during those years for maximum impact. And the idea is really around, the intervention strategies are really aimed at building the development of executive function and those related skills. So as an overview, SECURE has multiple components. We have pieces that are really focused on skill building for children, and those come both from a school-based intervention, after-school activities, but also from home-based interventions. We have materials that are really focused on school adults, and that work happens through schools and professional development workshops. And we have aspects of the intervention that are really focused on parents and family members. Those workshops happen in community settings, also school-based settings, but are really targeted towards parents and other caregivers, and are really about how to support the development of these skills in the home environment. So there's some more details about what is included in the SECURE interventions here. I'm going to kind of go quickly through this, but just to say that the supports are a mix of classroom activities, strategies, and routines that children and adults can use to build skills in the moment, and also sort of classroom and school climate supports to really change the culture of schools in ways that can better support children in this key area of development. So in our home-based or families work, we have really tried to build from our experience working with children in classrooms and extend the strategies and routines that we heard from teachers and other school adults that were really effective for working with children in difficult moments. And our work really builds on the assumption and the growing research base that suggests that executive function and self-regulation skills are critical for both children and adults. Children and adults use them every day to meet just everyday demands such as multitasking, focusing, being able to follow directions, deal with feelings in appropriate ways, and that these skills are really central to interactions and parent-child interactions in particular, because they're coming up all the time in the types of things that children and parents or other family members need to do together. So our families work has really focused on parenting, the everyday parenting interactions and parenting practices as a common experience, a common motivating context for adults to build their own skills in this area that can then transfer to other contexts. And what we mean by that is really thinking about core executive function and self-regulation skills that play out in adults' interactions with children, but that over time can then be generalized to the work environment or to planning and decision-making in terms of health decisions or financial planning or other areas that are really critical for low-income adults. The basic structure of our families program involved monthly workshops, 2-hour workshops that were facilitated by a mental health consultant, and they had a kind of mental health consultation approach, but in a social setting. So social support was a big part of it, really bringing parents together to talk about their experiences parenting and what kind of challenges they are facing in their everyday lives, and really share those experiences together and get support from one another, and also practice and learn strategies that can help address common challenges. So kind of key features of the intervention. What is it about? It ultimately, for families, our work has really been about stress management. And stress management in a broad sense in terms of how do parents who are living in poverty deal with the everyday stressors of their life, but also how to deal with the stressors that are associated with parenting young children who themselves are still struggling to build key behavioral skills, and many of the challenging moments that we all face as parents can really be triggers for stress responses in both adults and in children, which can escalate problem behavior. So our goal is to really interrupt that cycle of stress and problem behavior and to provide direct support to adults to help them better manage those challenging moments, those stressful moments with young children. When, as Stephanie described, the intervention is really designed to work with young parents who are in that kind of early adulthood phase, which we know is a real critical time for the development of executive function skills, and young children. So these are two critical moments for children and adults and real opportunities to build the skills. And where the context for our work is really home and parenting. So what are the common challenges of parenting that happen in the home or in parent-child interactions that can be critical levers for improving the quality of relationships, the interactions, and the executive function and self-regulation skills for both children and adults. And here I just want to make a comment. It's very hard to see it on the slide because it's so small, but I want to mention that the strategies and the workshops that adults go through are really aligned across the home and school environment. So we designed the intervention in a way to work where if teachers are using the secure intervention, they are talking about the same concepts and learning about and practicing the same strategies at the same time as family members are also talking about similar concepts, but thinking about them in the context of the home or the classroom, as the case may be. So the main message that we really aim to get across throughout the Secure Families work is this idea of interrupting the stress cycle and putting executive function or the control center back in control. So our work is really aimed at helping adults to notice when you're sort of experiencing your stressed self. We all have a stressed self, so stress is a normal part of life. Experiencing the challenges associated with parenting is normal, but those challenges can really be exacerbated under conditions of poverty and toxic stress. So helping adults to notice what it feels like when you are in your stressed self and what kinds of actions and words and behaviors that can drive in our parenting interactions. And then also learn to identify when are we in our best self. So when are we really in our thoughtful, planful, and supportive stance as an adult in our interactions with our children, and really helping folks to move from the stressed self state to that best self. In our families workshops, each workshop follows the same cycle, meaning that each 2-hour workshop has these components that happen in the same order each time. So workshops begin with what we call brain basics, which is an opportunity for parents to learn a little piece about brain development and about the development of key executive function skills. And then in each workshop, the facilitator also introduces a secure strategy, so a specific strategy that parents can use to help build executive function skills with their child or to deal with a common challenging behavior. So family members learn about a strategy, and then they spend time with other family members making a plan for how can I use this strategy at home this month. So what are the moments that are likely to come up in my daily or weekly routines with my children where I could use this strategy. So family members make a plan for it, and then they go home and they try it out, and we ask families to keep some notes and to just notice and document how that is going. Is it working? Are they able to use the strategy? Does it seem to be effective or not? And then come back the next month and start the next workshop by reflecting on how did it go? How did the month go? How did the strategy go? So this kind of cycle that the workshops follow each month is really designed to do two things. The first is that structure is really designed to build these core executive function skills such as planning, goal setting and reflection or monitoring that Stephanie talked about earlier in the presentation, these core EF skills for adults. And so adults are really getting the practice through the workshop cycle of building those planning, goal setting, and reflection skills. Now, the content of each workshop changes each month slightly. So there's a different there's a different secure strategy that's introduced each month, and the strategies themselves are really designed to build other executive function related skills, such as self-control, how to manage your own feelings in a difficult moment, strategies around stress management in particular, emotion skills, strategies that build positive communication with your children, or around disciplining and dealing with conflicts. So it's both the structure of the workshops and the content themselves that build these key skills. And what we have kind of come to hear from our workshop facilitators and from participants themselves is that there are these sort of meta concepts that emerge in participating in these family workshops, and that it's this idea of noticing, reflecting, making a plan, and trying something out. And that kind of process, which is practiced in the workshop cycle each month, and that then parents get an opportunity to try out over the month by having a plan. This is how I'm going to use this strategy, then trying it out with their kid or with their children multiple times over the month, and then thinking about how did it go, and being asked by the facilitator and talking with other parents, how did it go, what worked well, what didn't work well, and then kind of making next steps based on that reflection and trying out process. That process was really powerful for families, and that we don't often get the time or the opportunity to do that, but also that we don't always have the scaffolds to do that. We don't always have the supports in place to really help us try out a strategy, reflect on it, and then adjust our behavior, our thinking, or our plan in response to how it worked. So some example strategies from our intervention. What is adult self-regulation? So in our workshops, we've really focused on this idea of managing stress and challenging situations, and doing that in ways that are both positive and productive for the adult-child relationship. So we know that children's everyday behavior can be unpredictable. Emotions often run high. For young children, they don't always have the ability to talk about what those feelings are or what is the root of them. And this often happens at difficult and important moments of the day. So as Stephanie described earlier, when she defined those executive function skills, she did it in the context of the morning routine, getting out the door, because for many families, especially families that are working or trying to work, that process of getting the adult and the child out the door can be a stressful time of the day. So we think of this as a kind of pressure point, or a common lever for a common moment that can either go well or go poorly. And so it's both an opportunity to make small changes in how parents talk and interact with their children and support their children through those moments. It's also the kinds of moments that can be really toxic and can be recurring stressors that happen in the home. Adults have little time for breaks during this process, so it's a challenging moment. So learning how to address those moments successfully can have a difference in terms of how daily interactions and parent-child relationships are developing. So if we think about how sort of parent and child stress is interacting in a moment, we could think about child stress or child intense feelings shaping children's behaviors, which then can influence adult stress. It can increase the adult stress in the moment, and where we are really trying to intervene when we work with adults is the adult responses to behavior. So, for example, one of the activities we do early on in the Secure Families workshops is something we call pressure points. And I already kind of alluded to this, but the idea is to really work with adults to think about what are the high pressure, high stress moments in the context of the home or in your interactions with your child that really trigger your own stress, trigger your own negative emotions like anger or anxiety or frustration, and describe them. So we ask parents to do this little mapping exercise where we ask them to just describe what are your everyday routines with your child and where are the pressure points in your day, what are the kind of hot spots where things get tough. And what does it look like? What does it sound like then? What are the behaviors that are happening? What are the words that folks are exchanging with each other? And what are the outcomes sometimes? So we ask folks to really engage in this process of identifying their own pressure points. And we've found that it helps to have really concrete scaffolds for this process. So if you're imagining that there's a TV crew in your home that's filming your morning routine with your child, what do they see and how would they describe those interactions or those pressure points? If you're imagining that you're telling your best friend or a trusted mentor about the morning routine, how would you describe your own thoughts or feelings in those moments? So we have a lot of guiding questions and supports that help parents to really kind of dig in and reflect deeply on what those pressure points look like and feel like. And then the next step for us is really around, and what can we do to improve how those pressure points go in our daily routines. So we have a number of strategies that we work with families to develop and try out. One of them is what we call positive mantra, and the idea is really having a phrase that that you can get to quickly. So the idea being that in our most stressed and challenging moments, we often fall back on reactive behaviors. For families and for adults who experience trauma in their own childhood, it's challenging to not be triggered by those difficult moments with your own young children. So having a mantra that you can practice and then use in the moment to replace those other more negative, more reactive responses can be a helpful intervention in the moment. So helping adults to really replace negative thoughts, negative words with something that's more productive in their interactions with their child. So some examples of mantras that have come up: okay, I know how to handle this. This isn't his or her fault. He or she is still learning. This isn't my fault, but I can help. Or I've seen this before. I have an idea. Or this is part of what we are learning. And you can imagine these are phrases that might not be the first thing that comes to mind when a young child is having a really difficult time following directions or doing the thing that's been asked of them 10 times, or putting away the tablet or the TV or the video game. These aren't the first things that parents might draw upon to say, but often the punitive words that can come out in those moments can really escalate the problem behavior. So the idea here is to really come up with something that the adult can say and can say in their own mind as a way to help to de-escalate those moments. So our strategies around stress management for parents kind of fall into 4 areas. Some of them are really about just noticing the stress, and so the pressure points is one of those types of strategies that helps parents to really start to identify, where are the moments in the day where I'm experiencing stress and where where things get challenging in my own interactions with my children. Some of our strategies are really more about documenting that stress. which is a part of noticing and really trying to understand the stress. Some are about communicating it. So how do we talk with our children? How do adults communicate in those stressful moments? And then many of them are about managing the stress itself. And so in the next few slides, there's a bunch of examples. I just have about a minute to get through them, so I'm going to fly through. But one of the things we do to help folks notice and talk about stress is something called a stressometer or a stress thermometer. And it's a very simple idea that you can rate your stress from 1 to 5, 1 being low stress and 5 being high, just as a way to really notice for yourself, when is it something that's tolerable that I can manage, and when is it creeping up, and when is it becoming really, really difficult, and I really need to take a break, or I really need support in order to get through this. This aligns with some child tools that we have here. Flip through. Another strategy that we use and ask folks to try out is just a Post-it note strategy, where at certain times of the day we ask parents to document where are you, what was happening, and what was your level on the stress thermometer. So again, this is really to help parents start to identify where pressure points might be in their day. We ask folks to kind of track this over time. And then there's a couple of strategies that are really around how adults communicate in those stressful moments. So a simple one here is called iMessages, and this is also a strategy that comes out of our work directly with children. We really work on teaching children how to communicate their own feelings with simple statements like, I feel frustrated because my brother keeps kicking me under the table. So simple strategies to help kids really start to talk about their own feelings, and these we found have also been extremely useful in our work with adults and with family members. So really giving parents some tools to express their own feelings, and particularly in those challenging moments with young children. Another strategy that we have developed is something we call brain games, and brain games are short and fun games that can be played in the home setting. We also have a set for classroom settings, but they're really designed to build those core executive function skills like self-control, attention control, and flexibility and working memory. And so they're fun games that get kids doing things that are often silly or often movement-based, but at their heart are really opportunities to practice and build those EF skills. But we've designed a set of them to be kind of energizing games and a set of them to be calming games. And the idea here is that in difficult moments, both in classroom and home settings, that the adult can have something fun to suggest, like, let's shift how this is going. Let's take a break. Let's play a brain game together. It can be something that will help us to kind of calm down, to kind of bring our own stress siren down, but at the same time it's building core skills. So these have been a really successful component of our intervention. Both families and teachers say that they're able to use them pretty flexibly, and that they find that they really work to serve those purposes. So a couple other strategies here, but I'm going to just go ahead and wrap up by saying that the work around executive function and self-regulation, particularly in the context of poverty, has really highlighted how those skills are really challenged by toxic stress and by the conditions of living in poverty. But another part of that story is that we all face challenges to executive function, and that by thinking about sort of the common challenges that are happening for families, we can provide support in these moments that parents talk about as being really some of their biggest challenges. So acute stress management in the moment, in those difficult moments, like getting out the door so that you can get to work on time. What kind of strategy can you use to really improve how that moment goes? And also support that's specifically around children's behavior, challenging behaviors of young children. And that the supports that we have designed are really, we have tried to be as concrete as possible, meaning that there are things you can actually say or do in the key moments. So they come from bigger concepts, but the strategies themselves are things that should be relatively easy to implement, easy to try out, and find out if they work to really improve the moment. And that our kind of theory of action behind this is that over time, by being able to build those skills in critical moments, being able to use those strategies again and again, that the core executive function, self-regulation skills are improved and then are able to be transferred to other contexts like the workplace or in other decision-making around health and healthy behaviors. So thank you very much. I know that was a lot of information, but we are looking forward to hearing questions now.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And I see there have been a bunch of questions.
Yes, we do have a few questions. Let's see. How important is it for early identification of developmental disability at an early age in order to address intervention both at home and at school?
So I think the preponderance of evidence would suggest that the earlier the better, that with early identification there's just more opportunity for change, and that so I would say it's quite important. I don't think that means on the other side of everything that if early identification doesn't happen, that it's impossible for intervention to be positive and effective. But ideally, identification is early.
Does EF develop on the same time frame for girls and boys? Are interventions the same for both genders?
In my family, EF has developed on different time frames for girls and boys. So between my young son and my young daughter, it has appeared to be different. But that's really just a joke. I mean, it's actually true, but I don't think that it is necessarily the case in the literature. I think that there could be a little bit of evidence that girls acquire some of these skills more fluidly, perhaps earlier on. But there's no systematic knowledge base that would suggest that that is the case.
Although I think anecdotally, I mean, or not even anecdotally, but if you look at sort of disciplinary data from schools, we know that boys are much more likely to be engaged, to be dealing with the kind of disciplinary practices that come about from behavior management challenges. So executive function and sort of behavior management skills are so closely linked. So I think that there's certainly a lot of talk in our work with teachers and others around this very question. But as Stephanie said, there's not a clear message coming from the research that executive function development differs greatly between boys and girls. But it does seem like in terms of practitioners' experience with boys and girls' behavioral development, that some of this stuff can be more challenging for boys.
And one other thing about that, there is some evidence, and I think there was a news story about this relatively recently, so in the late fall perhaps, that suggested that boys on average tend to be more susceptible to risks in their environment. So there is some general picture that boys seem to be suffering to a greater degree or less resilient to the kinds of stressors and strains that come along with poverty, and that could influence this whole dynamic then.
Okay. How successful are these work groups in getting buy-in from the parents to actually go home and try these strategies out? And if you run into families who won't engage or practice at home, what strategies do you use to address this barrier?
That's a great question. So you've highlighted, whoever asked the question has highlighted a real challenge in this kind of intervention research, which is, the transfer to the real world and the real environment. And so Secure Families is relatively new. We developed it and tried it out at the same time over the course of last year, and gathered information from participants, our partner parents and schools, about feasibility and about what was effective for them, about what they tended to do and not do when they left the workshops. And so we do have some information about that. Our sense overall was that there was a great deal of interest in the workshops and in what we were providing. And we've noticed that there is a great deal of interest in supports for managing children's behavior. There's a great deal of interest in how the brain develops and the relationship between all of these factors. So when we began our pilot, there was a lot of interest among parents and grandparents and adults who were caring for children, and which was terrific. There were a number of things that I think over the course of the year really impeded participation, which included giant snowstorms, for example, the death of a child and the serious injury of a child in our two partner schools. So a number of things happened, but there was a kind of core group of parents from each partner school who maintained their involvement and I think really did try things out and come back and genuinely, authentically reflect on them, and they found that those things were quite useful. We had a mental health consultant who was working directly, who was delivering and working with parents in the workshops, and who was making calls. She was calling every family between each workshop, not to necessarily say, so what did you do, but instead to say, how's it going? What are you facing? What's happening for you right now? What can I help with? And I think that was an effective connector for families between the workshops, but also kind of a reminder like, oh yeah, I remember I was going to try that thing out, but also a real support for families. So I think that having a personal connection that isn't evaluative or demanding can be really helpful in maintaining that engagement between, in-person times when you see families.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The next question: do children in military families have any more or less stresses?
Well, we haven't worked in that context, so I don't think that we could can't answer that from our
direct experience, but not necessarily. I mean, there is some suggestion that children in military families face sources of stress that are somewhat atypical, meaning there's a great deal of mobility among military families, and there's often a great deal of uncertainty about either the primary or both parents who are deployed about where they are and when they're coming back, and that can be a very distinct type of stressor. But again, stress is tolerable when it's buffered by supports, and so even in the context of long deployment or multiple moves that might be stressors in a military context in particular, those can be mitigated by a supportive, welcoming family environment or a school environment that is safe and welcoming and engaging.
Is the secure curriculum accessible and free, and where can it be accessed?
So we have been working with Secure for a number of years, and Secure Families, as I just suggested, is very new. And we partner with all kinds of groups and organizations to implement and adopt and use aspects of Secure. So components of the school part, components of the teacher professional development, components of the parents part. But we aren't an organization that is yet at the point where it's just available for free or for purchase in a kind of systematic way. We would love to hear from you if you're interested in partnering with us on some endeavor. And we've written about secure components, so you can access the materials in a more general way through some of our papers and articles.
Let's see. Can you provide any ideas for assisting homeless families with young children?
So we think about that in a very particular way, which is how can one use what we have available to us? So use, for example, the resources that are embedded in Secure and deploy them in ways that are easy to access, scalable, doable, and relevant to different types of populations. And we've been thinking a great deal about how to draw components out of Secure and do them in ways that are more doable for highly mobile, perhaps super high stress populations and in those kinds of contexts. And so my advice and my suggestion is to think about what are strategies that can be used in the moment that are meaningful and useful to the population you're working with, that they may see a real and fast result from. It makes it more likely that it feels like it's worth doing. Becca may have some other suggestions, and we're happy to talk about this more.
Yeah, I think, as Stephanie said, this has sort of been, it's on our radar as sort of the next step, sort of. So our intervention was really first geared at a kind of universal population, but really trying to provide supports that were particularly important for low-income children and children who are facing multiple risks and stressors, but to be delivered in a context like school or family-based programming that was more universal. And we are now kind of shifting towards thinking about what are the key strategies that we've developed that have worked in ways that are really flexible for different kinds of people to use, and then could be kind of taken out of the broader program context and used to in other settings like shelters or other places where adults are working with young children.
Okay, let's see. Where can people get access to the brain games? And would you be able to provide us with a link for those?
So the brain games are follow the same principle, which is that they're embedded in this larger intervention. We should say that they are the component of the larger intervention that has garnered the most interest and has been involved. We've been involved in a number of projects where we've said, okay, there's a great deal of interest in the brain games. Can we pull them out and create them as an independent little entity and use them in different places? And we've done that, and we're piloting brain games as their own thing in a number of places in South Carolina, and we're learning about them, their value and their effectiveness on their own. And we're on the verge of a number of other partnerships focused specifically on the brain games. So again, we're completely open to any interest in partnerships around the brain games. In fact, we're always looking for those who are interested in thinking about how they might be used, whether they're effective, and how they could be adapted for different kinds of settings.
Okay, how do you see the issue of EF and adopted children, especially adopted through the state child welfare system? And can the high numbers of ADHD diagnoses be related to EF disorders affected by toxic stress?
Yeah, so there's a number of sort of developmental delays, learning disorders that are associated with executive function deficits. ADHD is certainly one of them. And there are folks who are really trying to understand that relationship. I haven't seen a clear message coming out of the research that links higher rates of ADHD to toxic stress in particular, but the general kind of theory and understanding of how toxic stress impacts brain development would certainly support that it disrupts executive functions, including things like attention control. So I think that's consistent with, part of our understanding.
What is your sense of how mental health service providers are aware of this brain science? What are the benefits and risk of diagnosing children with mental health conditions who are living in environments where they have adapted to an environment with a lot of toxic stress?
Those are great questions. I am not certain that the knowledge, that a deep understanding or even a superficial understanding of the dynamic between experiences of stress and strain and how the brain works and how that is tied to behaviors that we see in the world. I don't think that set of connections is well understood broadly. So we work with a lot of different folks, teachers, practitioners of other types, and this message, this story about the interconnections of these phenomena is always or frequently results in a kind of aha kind of moment. Like that's what drives that behavior that's driving me crazy. Or now I have a better understanding of what underlies what I'm seeing. So I really don't think that there's a great deal of understanding, and I think that there is. I think there's a great deal of danger in simply diagnosing children who have experienced stress and strain and who have adapted to it, perhaps successfully for that context, with a disorder. Our take on a lot of this work has been, how do you productively and proactively focus on skill building and, building positive skills in a general sense, rather than on identifying specific and individual problems to remediate. So I'm not sure what else to say about that, other than I think it's a substantial and significant danger. And it's sometimes a default in order to set families up or children up for access to services. So there's like a really complicated dynamic in there that you want individuals to have access to services, but do you want it to come at the cost of having a label that might not be super helpful? So I'm not sure what else to say about that. Do you have anything? Becca agrees.
Okay. Are the participants receiving other resources in addition to being a part of this program?
So there were kind of resources and materials that were part of the program itself, things that supported the use of the strategies. But beyond that, there was kind of two goals that we had in mind. One was that there would be a benefit around the social support, so having a cohort of families that would come together each month to kind of support each other and talk through their challenges associated with parenting. And then the other was that by having a mental health professional facilitate the workshops, that person that person comes from the community, that professional would be able to connect families to other resources. So, and that did happen in a couple of instances where the facilitator really built relationships with individual family members who came to multiple workshops, and that over the course of conversations at the workshop, but also in the follow-up calls that Stephanie mentioned, that things would come up, things that were happening in the child's life, questions or concerns that families had, or just major disruptions that occurred in the family's life. And our facilitator, the mental health consultant, was able to help those family members locate other resources to help deal with those events. So in that sense, there were some additional resources that were part of how we designed the program, but the primary focus was on sort of parenting challenges and strategies and resources to improve executive function and self-regulation skills.
Let's see, how is the SECURE program being evaluated? And did you measure any pre-post growth in executive functioning in parents and kids?
So we evaluated, as we indicated, there were the SECURE intervention has a number of components and features to it, and we first, in the long story about the SECURE development work, we first developed the curriculum for pre-K through third grade that is tied to school settings. And we did a big evaluation of that and found that children who had been exposed to SECURE, including a lot of the components that we then transferred and adapted for home and family, children who were exposed to SECURE after a year showed more focused attention than they did at the beginning of the year, and increases in impulse control, so over the course of the year and in comparison to kids who did not get the SECURE intervention. We also saw shifts over the course of the year in children's scores on the state standardized reading and math tests, and this was all happening in Arizona. So we felt that we had some pretty good evidence for the impact of SECURE on kids' skills, and we did a parallel but much smaller study of the pre-K version of it in Head Start and found some similarly positive outcomes as a result of the intervention. For SECURE families, we developed it on a very small budget that didn't have a very big research component to it, so we really think of it as a developmental pilot. We collected information about families, socio-demographic information about families. We collected information about participation. We collected information from them about their interest in and willingness to do the work, and the feasibility of the program in different kinds of ways. We did focus groups and interviews, but we didn't do a kind of classic traditional research study of the type that maybe you're thinking of. Not yet, but we will.
Okay, well, that is the end of our questions. Stephanie and Rebecca, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'd also like to thank all of the participants on today's call. We greatly value the feedback of everyone participating in these AIA webinars. The link for a brief online evaluation form will appear shortly. Take a few moments now to complete the form, and it will automatically be sent back to us. We'd like to receive feedback from every participant, so if you're participating in this call as part of a group, please be sure each member of your party receives this link. For those of you who are interested, our next webinar in the series, Using Brain Science to Improve Family Stability and Economic Mobility Outcomes with Elizabeth Babcock, is scheduled for Tuesday, March 22nd. You can find more information about the rest of our 2016 series on our website, aia.berkeley.edu. Thank you again.
Thank you.